Hey guys, as always, thank you for your questions. And if you have any new questions or your question didn't get answered, then just post it again on the bottom of this post. And don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered. So without further ado, let's get started. So Louis DeBrat asks, in your video on comprehensible input, you seem to insist on the fact that for beginners, input doesn't have to be comprehensible, implying that you may feel differently when it comes to intermediate or advanced learners. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. As an intermediate learner, do I get more bang for my buck by listening to stuff that's more comprehensible? In other words, seeing new words here and there, but mainly drilling down more common speech patterns until they're fully acquired. Or by listening to more complex stuff, less comprehensible, but more new words per session. So this is a really good question. And I would say that once you're an intermediate learner, it's probably better to focus on things that are between 90 to 95% comprehension. And the reason for this is that when you're a beginner, you're trying to go from 0 to 1. And that is a huge gap, right? Because you have no foundation in the language at all. Your brain can't even process the sounds properly. It has no idea how the grammar works. It doesn't even know the most basic words. And so you're really just trying to learn how to swim while you're drowning, in a way. And that is the most difficult part of the language learning process. But once you have some sort of foundation, then you're just trying to go from 1 to 2, which is a lot easier than going from 0 to 1. And so when you're a beginner and you really have no foundation, right, then, I think the way that the brain is structured is like when you're a baby and you don't understand anything, then, of course, you're trying to just acquire the most fundamental components of the language. And all the input that a baby gets is at the beginning completely incomprehensible. So the brain, I think the way it's built, it's when it starts a new language, it's not used to, but I guess it's programmed to be able to, listen to stuff that's not comprehensible, pick out, okay, what sounds exist in this language? What sounds do I need to be focusing on? What's the basic sentence structure? How do things conjugate? I think it's just built to be able to pull that stuff out of a giant sea of incomprehensible mush, because that's the way that babies do it. And so I think you can replicate that process and make really fast progress. Because, again, when you're trying to go from 0 to 1, your goal isn't to understand everything. It's just to start being able to understand some stuff. And so you might as well just give your brain real input and then let it try to pick out the stuff that it can understand from that. But once you're already at 1 and you're just trying to go to 2, then basically, since there already is some stuff that you actually can understand in the language, you already have some sort of foundation, then you want to be using this foundation to push yourself forward. And this is where I think the I+1 comprehensible stuff really comes in. Because if you understand 90 to 95% of something, then basically you can pick up that last 5 to 10% very quickly and easily. And that's why you want to focus as an intermediate learner on that stuff that's pretty comprehensible, but not 100%, right? It's like, if it's 98 to 100% comprehensible, then you're probably not going to be learning that much. But 90 to 95%, that's a really good kind of medium where you're understanding a lot, so you're not bored, you're still engaged, you can follow the plot, but there's still a lot of stuff for you to learn, and then you can pick that stuff up quite easily. And I guess I'm having a hard time articulating why this is different as a beginner, but think about it this way. If you're a beginner and something is 90 to 95% comprehensible, what that really means is that whatever you're consuming is basically comprehensible even if there was no language at all, right? Like, you could watch Dora with the sound off and still comprehend everything. Therefore, it's comprehensible input. But that's not really comprehensible in terms of, like, the language from your brain's point of view, right? Your brain has no infrastructure at all. So it's not, like, what I+1 is building off what you have. But if you have nothing, you have nothing to build off of. And so I think it's kind of fundamentally different. And I know that I've experienced personally, and lots of other friends that I've talked to, that when you start a new language, when you get lots of input, you just start noticing things. You start being able to hear the sounds much more clearly. You start being able to hear a word start and stop. You start being able to have common words to start popping out at you. You start being able to understand grammar without knowing why you understand it. And this is listening to stuff that is completely incomprehensible overall. So it's kind of just my intuition from my own experience that when you're a beginner, you just want to do it like a baby does it. Give yourself lots of exposure to real stuff. Your brain will figure it out. But once you do have some real foundation to work off of, you have a castle and you're just building onto it, then you want to stay in that kind of golden range of 90 to 95%. and that should help you improve really, really quickly. And you say, when you're talking about listening to stuff that's more comprehensible, still seeing new words here and there, but mainly drilling down more speech patterns. So that is not how I would think about it, though. I wouldn't think about it as drilling in other speech patterns until they're fully acquired, because that's just like, that whole idea of like drilling in sounds really weird to me. It's like, if you can understand it, then you understand it. If not, then not. There's no really drilling in. But basically, the reason why you want to stick with more comprehensible stuff is because it's going to help you acquire the 5 to 10% that you don't know more quickly. And so you acquire that 5% really quickly, and then you can move up to the next level of difficulty and just go up and up and up like that as you spread out. But also, I will say that when you first jump into a new domain, like let's say you've never watched the news before, and so you turn on the news for the first time, you only understand like 50%. Well, if it's a brand new domain like that, then to a certain extent, you can't just wait until you already have 90% comprehension, because domains can be so different from each other that there's no way to, like, the only way to learn how to understand it is by listening to it a lot. And so with the news, it might be that you've only immersed in anime, you got to the point where you can understand 100% of almost all anime, but then the news is still like 70% comprehension. Well, just go jump into the news, and what you should find is that very quickly your brain will kind of adapt to it, and your comprehension will jump up to that 90 or 95% really quickly, like in a few days to a week, because the more foundation you have in the language, the easier it is for your brain to figure out new domains, right? It's just going to be like, notice the small differences, and then notice how all its old models of the language like mostly still apply. So basically, to summarize, when you're first going into a new domain, then don't get so hung up on comprehension, but overall try to aim for between 90 to 95% once you are advanced. But yeah, as a beginner, I wouldn't really worry about that. I guess it all comes down to, once you have a solid foundation, you want to build off that foundation in I+1 fashion. But if you don't have any foundation at all and you're really at zero, you can't go from 0 to 1 in an I+1 fashion. You kind of just got to go jump in and learn how to swim while you drown. Kind of ad hoc style. That's what I would say. Especially if it's a language like Japanese and you only speak a Western language. And so there is really no commonality at all, and your brain is really just going to have to start from scratch. So Carson asks, ever had any plateaus, beginner, intermediate, or advanced? I.e., no new cards are sticking. If so, what was the remedy? Well, I find it really funny that you added the qualifier, no new cards are sticking, because I've had tons of plateaus, and I'm about to go into detail on them just now, like in a second, but I've never really had the problem of no new cards sticking. I mean, I don't know, some people just seem to have this problem. A minority of people, I would say, but I've met a few people now who, for whatever reason, they just forget all their Anki cards, no matter what they do, and it doesn't seem like it's an interval modifier issue. Like, they can have a smaller interval modifier, and they just don't stick. And I don't really know what to tell these people, because this never happened to me. It's like, for me, when I would learn an I+1 sentence card, and I had my interval modifier set at 100%, I would almost always just remember it. And it wasn't hard to memorize. It would be like, the card would come up, I get it wrong once, come up again, and then I would remember it. And that was it. And so if your cards are seriously I+1 and you have like your interval modifier set to 90 and you still just forget everything, then I do not know what to tell you. I mean, maybe it has something to do with the format. Maybe it has something to do with how you're using your mind. I don't know. But if anyone has any insight on this, like they had this problem but they found a way to overcome it, then please definitely let me know. But I mean, plateaus themselves are super common. Like, of course, I've had tons of plateaus. I think that anyone who's ever gotten really good at anything has probably experienced lots of plateaus. And this is just because it's the kind of part of the nature of improving at things, Because when you think about that, there is a divide between your perception of how good you are and the reality of how good you are. It's rare that these two are exactly the same, right? That's why we have the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? When you first start out, you are so bad, you're not good enough to tell how bad you are. And so even though that you suck, you think that you're good because you're not good enough to tell how bad you are. And so there's this gap between your perception and the reality. And so a lot of times what happens when you're getting better and better at something is they don't your perception and the reality, they don't grow alongside each other in parallel. One will grow a little bit, and then the other one will grow a little bit, and it'll kind of be like this. And so what would happen is, like, maybe there's a point where your objective ability is pretty like you've had a boost in your ability, and so you're feeling really good about yourself, right? You're like, okay, I can understand so much stuff now. I just finished my first book. I can understand like all the plots of anime, no problem, all this stuff. But then you might get a little bit better, and your perception will get updated because you actually improved, right? Like you improve, and your understanding of the language deepens, and this makes your perception more accurate. So you've actually gotten better. But now that your perception is more accurate, you realize, oh crap, I thought I was good, but I was just cocky. I actually suck. There's so much I don't understand. Like, I can get the plot, but there's so many little details that I miss. Like, it took me forever to get through a single book. And you haven't gotten worse. You've actually gotten better. But how you feel about your ability has changed because you've gotten better. And so this is kind of just what always happens is you wake up one day, and for some reason, you're like, man, I suck. And then you just keep on going, and then you wake up like a month later, and you're like, oh, damn, I'm on fire today. Like, I think I'm actually have gotten pretty good. I've made a lot of progress. And these two are just always going to come and go forever. Like, I still experience it, even today, where sometimes I feel like I'm really good at Japanese, and I'm super proud of my ability, and other times I feel like I'm nowhere close to where I want to be, and I have so much more work to do. And it all kind of just comes down to, your perspective and where you are in this kind of process. So the real remedy of a plateau is just to keep going and just to keep getting better, because a plateau, I think fundamentally, is actually caused by improvement. It's just hard to see it that way when you're in the midst of it. And so when you keep going, then eventually your ability will catch up to your perception, and you'll feel proud about yourself again. And so it's not really that anything is wrong in reality. It's just how you feel about things, And there might also be more legitimate plateaus in terms of is actually easier and harder for you to make progress at different points in the process. And this is just because, and I don't think this is limited to language learning as well, what you're actually doing in the process of learning a language changes depending on what stage you're at, And so if you, let's say, just before I talked about in the first question in this video, I talked about how the strategy you want to take in terms of how comprehensible you want your input to be should be different depending on whether you're a beginner or intermediate. Well, let's say that you've been doing something as a beginner that's been working really well for you for a bunch of months. You've been making really good progress, and now you graduated from being a beginner and now you're intermediate. Well, your old strategies aren't going to work as well anymore. You're going to have to develop new strategies, right? Like before, you would listen to stuff that was 30% comprehensible to 50% comprehensible, and you would make tons of progress. And you could tell, like, oh, last month I understood 25%, this month I understand 30, next month I'll understand 35. But then, once you get to 50, 60, 70%, maybe it'll start to feel like, oh, well, now it feels like I'm not really getting anywhere anymore. And so you'll have to change your strategy. And so it also could be that if you're in a transition period, then maybe it's time for you to switch up what you're doing, switch up your strategies. And that could be a cause of plateau as well. But honestly, I think it has more to do with your perception. Like I said, that was more common. And I've always had plateaus, like I said, it became a very normal thing. But the thing is that once you go through a bunch of plateaus, you kind of realize how this process works. You realize that, oh, sometimes you feel like you suck, sometimes you feel like you're good, and as long as you keep going, then you make progress. Because even if you feel like you suck, you can normally still look back to where you were 6 months ago and see that you're way better than you were back then. And so you kind of just realize that you shouldn't take your subjective feelings of how good you are or how bad you are too seriously, because those are fleeting and constantly changing. And so it's like when you're feeling like you suck, there's no point getting down about that, because it's not going to actually be productive. It's just going to make you feel bad and probably make you less productive. And so you might as well just kind of view those cycles from a meta perspective and not really let it get to you. And I know that's a lot easier said than done, but once you go through a bunch of plateaus, it'll just start to happen naturally. You're like, oh, yep, I guess I just finished my cocky phase. Now I'm in my I suck phase. And next month I'll probably be in a cocky phase again. But one thing that can help is try to reframe when you're in your oh I suck phase. try to reframe it in terms of, oh, well, I've gotten better. Now I can tell how much I always sucked. So although it feels like I suck, I've actually just gotten better. Focus on the fact that the reason why you feel that you suck is because you've gotten good enough to realize how much you suck. And that way, maybe you won't feel so bad about it. So Tengen asks, I'm curious to hear your current opinions on how to structure the playlist for passive listening. I know you made a video a while back detailing how you took a week's worth of shows watched and made that your playlist for the next week, and then rinse and repeat. And Nuke Marine mentioned something like a 30-hour playlist with certain types of audio, and then adding, removing audio as you immerse more. And there are others with different approaches. I'm just wondering if you have an updated opinion regarding this, or you still recommend just doing what you described in the video. Yeah, I pretty much have not updated my opinion on this. Honestly, I think all that stuff that Nuke Marine talks about is quite silly. I don't think it's really going to make a difference. I think it's kind of losing the forest for the trees. Because, I mean, really, ultimately, it doesn't matter that much what you're using for passive immersion, right? As long as you're paying attention to it. With all immersion, what matters most is that you're actually paying attention and engaged and not zoning out. That matters even more than the quality of the content itself. And repetition is useful to a certain extent, but I don't think there's anything magic about it. And so, basically, my idea was just, you want some repetition. You don't want it to be boring, because repetition makes things boring very quickly. Also, with passive immersion, you're listening while you're doing something else. You're not giving it your full undivided attention. And so if it's something that you've never listened before, it can be hard to keep up with it, right? Especially when you're not that fluent yet. And so if you use things that you've watched actively as passive immersion, then keeping up isn't really an issue, because even if you zone out for a minute, or you have to concentrate on what you're doing for a minute, and then you come back, you still know what's going on because you've already consumed all the material once. And also, you get the benefit of a little extra repetition. But I say you should switch that out every week, because things get boring really quickly. And even though repetition is very useful, remember, if you're not paying attention to it, then you're not getting any of the benefit of the repetition. And so if you listen to it so many times that it gets boring, and then you don't pay attention to it and you just zone out whenever it comes on, then everything is lost. As they would say in Japanese, motomoku mo nai. So not only multiple komonai basically means, like, if you were going to lend out money hoping to get interest on it, you not only didn't get interest on it, but the money that you lent out, you never got back. So it's just like all's lost. But anyway, that you can use it in situations like that. But yeah, so I actually really think that my approach I talked about in the video is a really simple way to get the best of both worlds. And I think that all the extra thinking and messing around with stuff that Nuke Marine does isn't really going to add to anything. And I also think that leaving things on your player for too long will just make them get really annoying, and then you'll zone out probably. And I don't think it would be that beneficial anyway. So, yeah. Jackson Hardy asks, you said you don't like anime because it's too far from reality. But what about anime that isn't supposed to mirror reality at all, such as ridiculous sci-fi or fantasy worlds? On that note, do you like fantasy shows in general, Western or Eastern? Not really a Japanese question, just curious. Well, I wouldn't... Like, you said anime isn't supposed... what about things that aren't supposed to mirror reality at all, like fantasy? But I think you gotta really... When you really think about it, right? Like, would you say... that when you're saying that fantasy doesn't mirror reality... I mean, obviously that's true in the sense of if you're watching a show about magicians and they're doing magic, then that obviously doesn't mirror reality because we don't have magic in our world. But in terms of the humans are still going to be realistic, right? Like, human psychology is going to be the same. And most TV shows or most works of fiction, at the end of the day, what they're about human psychology, right? Like, they're about character growth, about the emotional struggle between different relationships, how to deal with pressure and finding yourself, balancing expectations of other people and what you really want to do and so on. And so, And also, even also, if you're talking about some shows like Gundam or Legend of the Galactic Heroes or whatever, like sometimes some shows are about politics rather than individual humans. And even so, even if it takes place in space and we're talking about space colonies, the same political things, like issues that they're dealing with and that the show's about, like that stuff's all going to be reflected in reality. And a lot of times, if you go and look at, like, for example, Japanese like space colony sci-fi stuff, like Legend of the Galactic Heroes, like a lot of the inner dynamics of the politics mirror things from like Chinese history and things like that. And so really I'd say that any good work of fiction does mirror reality, even if on the surface it's a fantasy or a sci-fi, right? Like, isn't the point of most sci-fi to like, by showing you, like, for example, if you have, you know, a lot of typical sci-fi stuff, it like takes place in the future and you see how technology has totally ruined human life and made us all zombies or whatever, right? Because we're all slaves to technology. If we just say that's like one of the most, you know, typical types of sci-fi, the whole point of that is that it's showing you something about human nature, right? It's trying to give you a message that's relevant to us today. Like, hey, you know, all this new technology, if you're not careful, it could really take us in a direction that we don't want to go in. And so I would say that, yeah, any really good work of fiction, even if it's fantasy or sci-fi, should reflect reality in terms of human psychology, human politics, human interactions, right? Because all works of fictions are ultimately about humans. Even if they're anthropomorphized animals, they're really just about humans, and it's really about human psychology. And so one of the things I don't like about anime is that it doesn't accurately reflect human psychology, right? Like, they're just not realistic at all. Especially when you take the most prototypical high school anime, where the main character is super unaware of his surroundings and himself and all the people around him, and all the girls in the show like him for no reason at all, but he somehow can't notice that. It's like, that's not how human psychology works at all. And so my problem is not whether or not there's magic powers or not. My problem is that this isn't how human psychology works, and therefore it's not interesting to me at all, because I'm interested in actual humans. But definitely not all anime is like this. And there are anime that I like Neon Genesis Evangelion is a sci-fi, you could say, right? It's about aliens and giant robots and stuff. But really, it's about human psychology, right? It's about the basic psychological struggles of the characters, which normal people can relate to. And that's why it's such a popular show, right? Not because aliens and robots are cool, but because we have the same struggles within us as the main character. And also, and so there are anime that I like, and a lot of anime I like are fantasy, or more like sci-fi than fantasy. Like, I also really like the anime Psychopaths, which is basically showing what the world might look like after AI takes over, you could say, or at least after humans get AI. And that's a really interesting exploration, because even though it's science fiction, like I said, it's exploring human psychology. It's exploring, hey, what if you grew up in a world where AI is controlling everything was normal? What would you think? Like, how would you view yourself and society? And it actually explores that, and so it's really interesting. And, like Cowboy Bebop 2 is another really good show that is about humans, right? It's about characters. Even though it takes place in space in the future, and they're space cowboys or whatever. And so I do like anime, but I just say it's like a very small minority of anime, and that I do really appreciate. And in general, I wouldn't really say I'm into fantasy in terms of, like, stuff where there's like Game of Thrones or stuff like that. I'm not really into that, but I am interested in. I do like some science fiction, and anime that, like, good science fiction anime can be really good. Like Serial Experiments Lain and stuff. Like, the stuff I was talking about was really just about the most prototypical anime. But there are, of course, good anime. But in my in my opinion, the good anime are exceptions, not the norm. Although, of course, that is true to a certain extent with all forms of media, right? Like, of course, most movies suck. We just remember the ones that are good. But, I mean, also, in general, I just don't really like the feel of anime, and kind of like since the art and the way of speaking is so far removed, then it does make it harder for me to kind of relate to the characters. Only there are shows that are so good I can get over it, But like I said, it's like even when I'm talking about psychopaths or fantasy sci-fi shows, it's like I said, it's really about the human psychology, and the art and the way that they talk does take me out of that. But there are shows that are really good, and I like despite that. So Kyle Wilkinson says, are there any good books or websites that are full of katakana? I've played games like Pokemon, which has a lot, but I was wondering if there are any other types of sources. Also, I remember you mentioning in an older video, I think it was an interview, can't remember, that a native can read and understand most katakana words instantly, whereas you would have to slow down to understand it / read it. Would you say that you're at native level yet? I mean, I can give you sources that have more katakana than other sources, but it's hard to really say to think of a source that's all katakana, because when you think about it, like, unless you're consuming something that's made for children like Pokemon, and therefore they're completely avoiding kanji usage, then the max katakana you can get is if you're watching like a show where all the characters' names are katakana because it takes place abroad, right? Like if you read Legend of the Galactic Heroes, or you read or you watch like a Chinese or Korean show with Japanese subtitles on, there's going to be a lot of katakana because every single personal pronoun is not personal pronoun, but every single koyu meishi. What's the word for koyu meishi in English again? Like every place and person is going to be in katakana, right? Because it's like if the show takes place in Korea, then every time they refer to a place, that's going to be Korean. Like the names of the place is going to be Korean, so it's going to be katakana, and all the characters are going to be katakana. So basically any work of fiction that, or it could be nonfiction, if you're reading about like a war that happened in Germany, there's going to be lots of katakana as well. So basically anything that takes place outside of Japan is going to have more katakana, but still it's not that much because it's just the characters and the place names basically. And so if you really want to train katakana, then I do think Pokemon is really good because there's so much katakana in it. But another option is to just take a normal book and then put it into a converter and convert all the kana to katakana. And I'll put a link in the description of this video or on the Patreon page to online kana converters, because there are converters where that you can convert all the kana to either hiragana or katakana. So you can get an Aozora Bunko book, like a novel, and then put the whole thing in katakana and then just read the whole thing in katakana. And that's probably the best way to train if you want to actually like train katakana to get better. And about your question about my ability, so I definitely have gotten a lot better. I haven't really thought about whether I'm native or not. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that I've fully caught up to a native in terms of my katakana reading ability, just because I haven't measured, right? Like we'd have to get a native and like have a competition to really see, but I've definitely gotten a lot better. And the other thing that I notice is that there's a big difference between reading katakana words that I already know and words that I've never seen before. Because if there's a katakana word that I already know, like teiburu or America, then it's like extremely instantaneous. Like within a millisecond of my eyes seeing the word, I already know what the word is. And it's almost like kanji. It's like my mind just takes in the whole thing at once. It doesn't even view it as phonetic. It's just like when I see teiburu, it's like the whole thing is just a snapshot. And I can just instantly know what it is. But if it's like a name that I've never read before, then I do have to sound it out. And I imagine that I'm probably still slower at sounding it out than Japanese people, because it's so hard to get practice for that, right? Even if you get tons of input, most katakana words are going to be words you already know. And like I just said, it's kind of different to read a word you already know and just get faster at recognizing those as like a single picture and actually sounding it out. But then again, it's hard to say how fast Japanese people are sounding out words they've never seen in katakana either. But I do remember watching a Hikakin video a long time ago where he was reading some box and there was a bunch of katakana words, and you could tell that he was actually reading it for the first time. They weren't actually words, and he was super fast. And that was the moment where I was like, oh damn, Japanese people are way better at reading katakana than me. But that was a long time ago, so I don't know. Basically, I've definitely improved, but I'm not confident not confident enough to say that I've fully caught up to natives, because natives are pretty godly on things like this. So Hicksto says, so you mentioned the things people say in anime are a lot different than what people would actually say in real life, and put a bit of concerning emphasis there for me with the whole animation to how people actually look ratio. I've heard people discard this ever since I got into AJATT and MIA, but how exactly does one make the distinction if they commonly immerse with anime over other live filmed material? Is this just done simply by observing live conversations? And if so, how long would it take to get a good understanding of what would be appropriate without making too many mistakes? Or by some other means? It feels like if you begin to output, it may be too heavily based off the way it was acquired from anime, and I'm pretty sure no one would want to come off like that from the get-go. Okay, so basically, it seems like you're just concerned about how you're going to get a sense for what is natural Japanese, what is not, if a lot of your input is coming from anime. And one thing that I would say is that you want to make a distinction between scripted Japanese and unscripted Japanese, because that is where things get really different. In a way, you could think about it as written Japanese for spoken Japanese, but in a way, anything that was scripted is written Japanese, even if it was scripted like as a conversation that was supposed to be had. Like, for example, if you watch a Japanese drama, they're having a conversation, but the conversation is scripted. It was originally written down by somebody. And because written Japanese and spoken Japanese are so different, whenever a Japanese person sits down to try to write a spoken conversation, they can't help but make it unnatural. And what I mean is that make it like written language, because they're writing, and written Japanese is so different, and they can't separate that in their mind so much. And that's why when you watch dramas, there's still a lot of stuff that I'm like, no one would say that. That is way too like grandiose, and like no one says that word in that way in real life. And there's a lot of moments like that. And so really, when you're talking about natural Japanese, you want to you're talking about stuff that's unscripted, right? The Japanese people just said off the cuff without preparing for it in an actual conversation. And in a way, anything that's unscripted is by definition, it's natural, right? And it doesn't matter whether this is real life or on a stream or on a YouTube video or anything. What matters is that they don't have a script. And even if they have a script, meaning like they have a bullet point list of what they want to talk about, that's different. I mean, they don't have a script that has word for word what they're saying. So they're still spontaneously coming up with words and stringing those words together into structures. So that is what natural Japanese is. And when you look at what Japanese people say when they don't have a script, it's very different than what Japanese people think people say when they're writing a script, right? And so basically, this is your dilemma that you might be worried about, worded differently, is how do I know what unscripted Japanese is like when all my input comes from scripted Japanese? And basically, the only way to get a good grasp of what unscripted Japanese sounds like and like what is actually used in unscripted Japanese is to get a lot of input from unscripted Japanese. But you don't have to do this with live conversations. You can listen to streams, you can listen to radio shows, you can listen to podcasts, you can watch Terrace House, you can watch YouTube videos that were minimally prepared for. There's tons of ways that you can easily get natural, unscripted input from the comfort of your own home. And so basically, you just go and find a bunch of that you like, immerse with a whole bunch of it, and then you'll get an idea. Okay, this is what normal Japanese sounds like. It's kind of like how in anime, they have this weird thing called yakuwariko, which is basically structures or words that only certain character archetypes use. Like, for example, if you are a very girly girl, then you might use kashira and like the ending particle wa, like, so da wa, kore, ii kashira, kore, or whatever. Like, in anime, in real life, no one says those things. But, well, not no one, but young people don't say those things, male or female. And also, in anime, only a certain character archetype says those things, right? Or like Naruto will say like "datte bayo" at the end of stuff. But no one says that in real life either. And there's tons of things, right? Like there's the way that old people talk, like they say "jaro" instead of "daro," and like "soja," and all like "so kano" and all this stuff. And so maybe if you've started to understand anime, you realize it's very easy to get a sense of what type of language belongs to what character archetype, right? It's like very quickly you realize, oh, ja no is what old people use. Kashira is what girly girls use, right? Daze is what like shonen and guys use that are trying to sound cool, right? So just it's very natural for your brain to be associating different registers of speech with different character archetypes or different situations or different feels, and same with Kegel, right? It's like you realize like, oh, people say des when they're talking to a higher up, and they might even say gozaimasu if they're like trying to be super polite, like they're like bowing and basically doing this other guy's bidding or whatever. Like if that's the relationship, then they might use gozaimasu. Even if you don't articulate it in words like this, it's just intuitive to grasp. And just through watching a lot of anime, you'll realize like if you see a girl who's using ore, that'll just be really weird to you. It's like, why is she using ore? That's only I've only ever seen guys use that. That's weird. And so basically, if you get input from unscripted sources, this will just naturally sprout out to that as well. Like after watching a bunch of natural input, you'll just realize like, oh yeah, I've listened to like 500 hours of guys and girls talking in Japanese, and sometimes they use des when they are being more polite, sometimes they don't. But they never use kashira, they never use kana, they never use words like choetsuru or like let's see, like kanarazushimo or like skoburu. Like they almost never use things like that. And so you just get a sense of like what do normal people actually say. And one thing you can do is just if you're not sure whether something's natural or not, just ask yourself like, have I heard someone actually use this like off the cuff, unscripted, have I ever heard that before? And if the answer is no, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's not natural, but it means that you don't know if it's natural or not. Whereas if you say, have I ever heard someone say like "so dane" in a natural conversation, an unscripted conversation? Oh yeah, tons of times. Okay, well I know that's natural. So there's always going to be a category of stuff where you're not sure, but there's also going to be a category of stuff where you are sure. And as long as you stick to that, then you're going to be fine. And the other thing is that if you watch my video about how to start outputting, I talk about how you should choose a parent and try to model the way that you speak exactly after them. And so if you actually go and watch that video and you follow the instructions, then there's no way you're going to fall into the kind of bad situation that you're worried about. Because, ultimately, you only have to speak one way. And that one way of speaking does have to encompass a large variety. Like you have to know how to speak polite, and you know how to be casual and all this other stuff. But basically, you only have to mimic one person. And so ultimately, you don't have to know whether the word like skoburu is natural or not. All you really have to know is, does my parent use the word skoburu? Like when he's talking off the cuff. If he does, then I'm going to use it too. If he doesn't, then I'm not going to use it. And that's kind of the whole point of adopting a parent, is that it makes the target you're aiming for smaller, which is actually easier because then you know when you're hitting the target and when you're not. And so basically, as long as you follow my instructions on how to output and you choose a parent and you mimic the parent, then there's no way that you're going to have this problem. But in general, if you do want to have a really strong sense of what different types of words come across in what way to natives, then you really just have to get a very broad variety of input, right? Because just like if you always immerse in anime, you'll get a really strong sense of the meta within anime, and you'll know like, oh, within the anime meta, like sometimes girls use boku, and it's this type of girl who uses boku, even though boku is normally for guys. Well, if you immerse also like you watch TV a lot, you watch variety shows, you watch the news, you listen to podcasts, you watch stuff from Kansai and stuff from Kanto, then that sense will just naturally spread out, and you'll be like, oh, they use that in Kanto, but not really in Kansai, or they use that in Kansai, not really in Kanto, or like, oh, sometimes like I've heard girls say this, but not really guys. Or like, oh, sometimes people, like academic people say this, but more young people or casual people don't say it. And so it's just a matter of like, yeah, there does come a point where you want to actively spread out your immersion resources and spread out what you know. But you can do that at any time. I don't really think it's something you have to worry about too much beyond what I said in that video. So Simone asks, hi Matt, As far as I can remember, you've never spoken about video games. Do you play any video games in Japanese at the moment? Did any of them improve your vocabulary somehow? Would you recommend some, and at what stage? So I've never really played video games my entire life. I played Pokemon as a kid, and I really liked Pokemon as a kid, but besides that, I have just never played video games. And I think part of the reason for this is that ever since I was in 6th or 7th grade, I've always had one single obsession. And the obsession changed throughout my life. Like at one point it was skateboarding, at one point it was pen spinning, and I've gone through many different phases. But I always normally have one thing that I'm really into, and when I'm into it, my whole life is about pursuing that one thing. And starting from about high school, it was also important to me that that one thing I was pursuing would somehow benefit me in some way, or like, contribute to me growing my skills or becoming more mature or learning more. And so video games just never really fit into my life because I knew I didn't want to, I knew I wanted to have a singular focus and really just try to master one thing because that was what was most fun for me and what made my life feel the most fulfilling. But I knew I didn't want to focus on a video game because, that's nothing really comes out of that. It's like, if you play World of Warcraft and you become the best World of Warcraft player in the world, that's great, except you still, pretty much don't have any other useful skills. And it's not very transferable, and it can't really do that much for you. And so, for me, sometimes I would try to play video games because, my little brother, he actually loves video games. And he's very passionate about it, and he likes to analyze video games and think deeply about them, and, views them as an art form. And I totally respect that. And he will tell me about video games and about why a certain video game is actually so impressive and why playing it is such an amazing experience. And I've been really intrigued. And so I'd go and try to play the video game, but it's just so boring because it feels like a chore. It's at least when I'm watching a TV show, I don't have to do anything, even though I know it's not that productive. But when I'm playing a video game, it's like doing homework. That's what it felt like for me. It's you have to go and actually do stuff, even though it's just for fun. So it's why am I working hard and doing stuff for something that's not going to benefit me at all? It's since this is just for fun in the first place, I don't want to do work. I just want to consume it. And that's what I would always feel like. And so, I really wanted to play Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy because those are so deeply seated in Japanese culture, and I wanted to get all the references, and my brother, also likes them too. He told me about them. But I could just never get past it, the first couple hours because it was so boring for me. And so I never have played video games, and that's why I can't really talk. And so it's not that it has to do that much with language learning. It's not like I thought they would be bad input. It was mostly just that I've never liked video games. And I'm not, if you like video games, I'm not criticizing you. It's totally, I know that I'm just weird in this way. I'm the minority. Most people like video games, and I don't. And it's really not that I think they're bad, so I avoid them. It's I have tried to play them, and they're really boring for me. But if you are learning Japanese, then of course there's a lot of video games that are very text heavy. And I will say that when you're thinking from a purely immersion quality point of view, unless you're playing a visual novel, basically you could put all video games on, you could rank them by their immersion quality in terms of how much input you're actually getting, right? So if you play this game for an hour, how many words are you going to read and how many words are you going to hear in the language? And the higher this number, then the higher the immersion quality. And when you think about how if you're listening to a podcast or an audiobook, you're hearing words nonstop every single second. Or, for example, when you're reading a book, words are coming into your eyes every single second. It's hard to imagine that a video game could actually match that. Although I'd say if you're playing a visual novel, then you get extremely close. For the most part, visual novels are top-notch immersion quality. But normal video games, where it's an RPG, it's pretty low immersion quality compared to something an actual book or a manga or something. But, we can't be talking about efficiency all the time. And if you're a big video game fan and a lot of your motivation is playing video games in Japanese, then definitely I would say that that's probably a good immersion source for you. And some video games are good in between, right? They do have a lot of text. I've heard people say that, Final Fantasy games or Zelda games have a lot of text and are good reading practice. And so if you really love video games, then and it's really motivating for you and you really enjoy it, then even though the immersion quality is like not as high as some other things, I'd say that it could be justified by your passion for it. And even if you don't love them that much, every once in a while it can be good to just play a video game, especially if there's like one that you're particularly interested in, to give variety and just mix things up. Because again, you don't have to be pursuing efficiency all the time, but it's just something to keep in mind, that you want to find a balance between enjoying yourself and actual immersion efficiency, I would say. And so you also asked at what stage would you recommend them? So I'd say that it pretty much applies to every stage, although if you're probably starting from intermediate and above, because if you're really a beginner and you have no foundation, then it's going to be really hard to learn from a video game, right? It's like if you're trying to play Pokemon or Zelda as a beginner, then you're pretty much just going to not understand the text at all, and you're pretty much just going to be ignoring the text and just playing the game based off of the visuals and the mechanics, and if you've played the game before, then your memory. So I would say probably beginner, intermediate. It applies to be intermediates and above, I'd say. As a beginner, probably not that ideal. So Jackson Hardy asks, could you talk about deconstructing language assumptions? I can't give any specific examples other than trying to wrap your head around the SOV order of a sentence, but I would greatly like to hear your ramblings on trying to unlearn one's assumptions on communication. I hope that makes sense. Well, I would say in order to unravel an assumption, you have to become aware of it, right? The tricky thing about assumptions is most of the time you don't realize that it's an assumption. If you knew that it was an assumption, then it'd be easy to let it go. But there are things that are true for your own language and culture that you've basically learned when you were really young, and you've been just working like assuming that that's true your whole life, to the point where that assumption kind of becomes invisible to you. It just falls into the background, and it just is so deeply integrated into your perception that you don't realize that you're viewing a world through that certain lens, or that you're always assuming that this thing is true. You kind of just feel like it's part of reality. And so it's really just about becoming aware of that and realizing like, oh, I thought this was just an inherent part of reality, but actually this is just a belief I have or an assumption, and it might not be true. Because once you get to that point, then it's really easy to go and confirm, well, is it true or not, by paying attention to Japanese people and the Japanese language, right? So if you, I'm having a hard time thinking, it's hard to think of just an example of like, what's an assumption that you might have going into learning Japanese that would be wrong in terms of communication. Like, I mean, it could be things like, there's, like, for example, this is a bad example, but just for the sake of explanation, let's say that you look up the word translation and you see that that like tsuyaku comes up, and so you just assume that tsuyaku means translating like it does in English. And in English, you can say, like, you can use translating in terms of the word of interpretation, like, oh, he's translating for me. Meaning like, hey, we're going to go to an event and he's going to stand by my side and translate everything to me and translate what I say back to the other people. And it can also mean like I'm going to translate a book. But tsuyaku in Japanese doesn't refer to anything that's written. It just refers to in-person, in real-time translation, interpretation. So it could be that you think that tsuyaku, that the use of tsuyaku is just as broad as translation is in English, but in reality it's not. And so it's all about becoming aware of those assumptions, right? Because then you can see it's true. You can be like, okay, wait, I had this assumption, but is tsuyaku used that broadly? Well, what do I know that tsuyaku is used for? Well, I've only heard it used in the context of live, in-person, in real-time translating of language. So maybe it's not used in the written language. And then you can just keep that in your mind, and then that can become a kind of hypothesis for you. And then as you keep getting more input, every time the word comes up, you'll like remember your hypothesis and be like, oh, yep, that meets my hypothesis. And after a while, then you can just kind of, assume that, make a new assumption that, okay, well, I've pretty much never heard tsuyaku been used in the context of books, so I guess you can't use it that way. And of course, you can use dictionaries as well if we're talking about a single word, but you also have to remember that a lot of times people, like, when people are arguing about whether you're using a word correctly or not, they're like, oh, well, the dictionary says this. But it's not like first there was the dictionary and then there was spoken language. It's like first there was spoken language and then someone retroactively tried to describe the reality of language, and that was the dictionary. And so it's totally plausible that the person who made whatever dictionary you're referencing missed a certain pattern, right? He had a certain assumption that was wrong because he wasn't attentive enough to the reality of language, or it could be that language has changed. So I wouldn't rely too much on dictionaries, especially Japanese dictionaries. I find flaws in Japanese dictionaries all the time. But if you're talking about communication type stuff, then I think the biggest thing is just keeping in mind the possibility that there always could be something that you're not noticing. That's the mindset you have to go into it with. Whenever you're immersing or you're seeing a conversation, you just have to assume it's like, okay, I'm missing something. What am I missing? And if you take that mindset, then your brain will notice a lot of things for you, right? And you might notice, like, let's see, what am I missing? Japanese people seem to be moving their heads a lot. Maybe that's important in communication. And you start paying attention to that more. And then you realize, oh, wow, Japanese people are constantly bobbing their heads all the time, whether they're listening or speaking. And when they're bobbing their head, they're normally bobbing their head to match the pitch accent. And they seem to go up right before the mora drops. Right before the pitch drops. Like on the last mora, they like go up right before it would drop. And things like that. And maybe you also notice, like, when Japanese people are talking, having a conversation, and one of them is talking for a while and the other one's listening, the other person seems to like make a lot of weird noises, like like way more often than Americans would do. Maybe that's important because I seem to do that a lot. You pay attention, you realize like, oh yeah, every single time that one Japanese person is talking and the other is listening, they always do this other thing. So I guess that's normal for them, and probably if I didn't do that, that would feel weird because they are expecting that people are going to do that. So it's basically just the idea that, man, there are tons of things that I could notice, but I haven't noticed yet. What are they? And as soon as you go into that mindset, your mind kind of goes into pattern recognition mode. It will naturally start trying to find things. And this is about your own assumptions too. It's always just, what assumptions do I have that could be wrong? Like, could this word actually mean something different than what I think it means? Could it have a broader use? Could it only have a more narrow use? And basically just always questioning things, always questioning your own knowledge, your own assumptions, and assuming that you don't have it all yet and that you're trying to find something that you're missing. You'll naturally just notice more and more and more. And I still notice stuff all the time. And there's no giant checkbook of everything that you need to notice to function well in society. And I don't think you could ever really create anything like that. So really, you kind of just have to take this approach of always trying to notice more. And then if you have close Japanese friends, you can ask them, man, is there anything I do that's kind of weird? Like that, like made me feel not Japanese or like made you feel uncomfortable or whatever. And then they'll probably be like, oh yeah, well, when I first met you, I noticed you did this thing. I thought it was so weird. Now I'm used to it and it doesn't bother me anymore, but blah, 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 blah. And then you can go and try to fix those things. So it's kind of the same with everything else. It's just get lots of input, try to analyze the input, try to find the patterns yourself, and you'll find most of them, but there'll probably still be some stuff that falls through the cracks, and then you can get native input for those things. But I would say it's just never, it's all about not being complacent, always looking to learn more, always looking to find what you're missing, and really you only stop improving once you get complacent and you stop caring. So Kleptomania asks, have you ever considered trying SuperMemo instead of Anki, and do you think it could be potentially valuable? Anki is based off of an older SM algorithm, SuperMemo algorithm. So in theory, a more current version of SuperMemo would be better, right? So yes, I actually have there was a period a few years ago when I used SuperMemo for about 6 months. And there were 2 reasons why I decided to give SuperMemo a go. First was the algorithm, like you say, and the other one was the incremental reading feature. So the SRS was basically invented by the guy who created SuperMemo. Something Wozniak is his name, the Polish guy. And he has this other idea about incremental reading, which is this combination of reading and SRSing that is kind of complicated, and I won't go into it here, but I can put a link to it in the description. And he says it's the future of learning, and he's always talking about how amazing it is, but you pretty much need SuperMemo to do it. So I thought that was really cool. I wanted to give it a go, so I downloaded SuperMemo, and I also knew the algorithm was better, so I gave it a shot. But I ended up not using it very long because it was so hard to get used to. The user face The user interface is super confusing and convoluted and cluttered. When you right click anywhere in the program, this menu opens up with just a million options, and you choose one of those options, and then a second menu pops up with like another giant host of options. There's just a million features, and it's really poorly organized, and it's just really hard to use. But the algorithm is definitely way better. And actually, when I was doing research for the stuff about the Loki Anki and changing the interval modifier and stuff, I looked a lot more into the SuperMemo algorithm. And once I understood how it worked, I realized it is a lot better than Anki, like significantly better than Anki. It takes so many things into account. And the other thing about the SuperMemo algorithm is that there's not very many options for you to change in terms of the actual algorithm. There's a million things you can do in terms of your cards and stuff, but in terms of the actual algorithm, it only lets you change one thing, which is your desired retention rate. Whereas in Anki, you know how when you open up the deck settings, there's a million options to choose from. You know, what's your interval modifier going to be? What's your new interval elapse? What's your graduating interval? What are your learning steps? And SuperMemo doesn't give you any of the options to change this stuff because it just automatically finds the most optimal setting and is constantly adjusting it so that all your settings are completely optimal, except for your actual retention rate, because that's not really a matter of being there is an optimal retention rate if your goal is to learn as much material, to retain as much material as possible, because the more you're willing to forget, then the more you are able to learn in a certain period of time. But most people, or for a lot of contexts, right? Like if you're going to middle school, you can't afford to forget more in order to retain more. You might have to actually just remember everything, and so you might want a very low retention, a very high retention rate, very low failure rate. And so that's the only thing that it lets you change, because that's the only thing that's actually different from user to user, and the rest it just automatically calculates to make it optimal. And it takes things into account like the possibility that you graded your card wrong, right? Because let's say that like 50% of the time, whenever you press the easy button on a card, the next time the card comes up, you fail it. Well, that means that there's a 50% chance that when you press easy, you graded your card wrong. And it actually takes that into account. So it is actually checking to see, okay, well, how good is this guy at grading his cards based off of how, his retention rate and stuff. And it takes all that into account. So it's crazy how much it takes into account, and it's based off of a ton of user data, because they actually take all the data from their users who spend years and years using the program, and they use that to hone the algorithm up even more. And so I do think the algorithm is significantly better than newer SuperMemo algorithms, but I don't know how much of a practical difference that would actually make in your learning, especially if you're using Loki Anki, because Loki Anki already makes Anki way better. And especially in language learning, maybe we could assume that it'd be like 20 to 30% better. And so that would be nice, but you also have to take into account that it's super hard to use SuperMemo in terms of just the user interface. It's super hard to get used to. There's no mobile version. It only exists for PC. And you can't use subs to SRS with it. You can't use MorphMan with it. There's no add-ons at all. There's no Japanese support. There's no integrated dictionaries. There's no Voracious. There's no anything. No Yomi-chan or anything. And so, overall, I think that it's not really worth... If you're just learning languages, I don't really think the benefits outweigh the cost. Because, like I said, not being able to use any of those add-ons, not being able to rep on mobile, that's a huge loss. And I honestly think that loss is bigger than the benefit of having a better algorithm. So I think for most people, SuperMemo isn't really going to be worth switching over. But I do want to, in the future, make my own SRS, which would basically take the best of both SuperMemo and Anki. We would reverse engineer the SuperMemo algorithm and put it into something that's easier to use like Anki, but it also have a lot of other features that Anki doesn't have, and it'd even be easier to use than Anki, because Anki is pretty convoluted in its own right. But I don't know how long that will be. So, Offsflug asks, after how many years of AJATT would you get confused for a native speaker on the phone? So this is a very vague question. I'm assuming it's talking about just the average person off the street. And I don't know what you mean confused for a native on the phone. You mean like after a 3-minute conversation, after a 10-minute conversation? It's not very hard to trick someone into thinking you're a native speaker for 15 seconds on the phone, you know? But it's a lot harder to trick them into thinking that they're native for 15 minutes. And also, if you're talking about Japanese in particular, this is kind of a tricky thing because there are so few foreigners that are at a high level of Japanese that even if you do have a foreign accent when you're speaking, Japanese people are much more inclined to assume that you are either a native with a speech impediment or a native who speaks a regional dialect than a foreigner, just because it seems so improbable that there's a foreigner that have reached this high of a level. So just because that a Japanese person assumes that you are a native speaker of Japanese, that doesn't necessarily mean that you actually sounded like you were born and raised in Tokyo, or even that you even really sounded Japanese. It could be that you just sounded really weird, but in their mind, there's no way that a foreigner could have reached this high of a level, so it has to be someone with a speech impediment or something, you know? It's like, that's the last thing they're expecting, is that there's going to be a foreigner that reached a high level, and so, in a way, you don't have to be that good to make a Japanese person assume that you're a native when you're talking to them, but you could still totally have a foreign accent. And so, if we're talking about you want to, taking that all into account, I'd say if it's just a short conversation for like a few minutes, like you're ordering a pizza, you could get to the point where the person you're talking to assumes you're a native after 2 years, but it's going to depend on a lot on the person, because the biggest factor in whether or not you sound native is your accent, right? Because even native speakers, they misuse words, they make lots of grammar mistakes, they stutter around, they fumble around when they're speaking, but their pronunciation is almost always perfect. So some people are just really bad with foreign accents. I believe there is a component of natural talent. Of course, there also is much more. What matters a lot more than your natural talent is how much work you put in. And even if you don't have natural talent, if you put in work, you can reach a higher level than most people who don't put in work but do have natural talent. But if you just do vanilla AJATT, like the way that Katsumoto explains it, where you're pretty much just getting lots of immersion, you never study pitch accent, you do some shadowing, but you mostly just output, and you like don't really go out of your way to ask for corrections that much, then there's going to be a huge disparity in the level that people reach. Like I know people that did AJATT and they got pretty fluent, but their accent still sucks. And then I know other people who their accent was very good after just doing vanilla AJATT. So if you there's going to be a lot of this disparity in terms of that, which means that if you're really good, you could, after 2 years, you could trick someone to thinking you're native on the phone. If you're not that good, like you don't really have a natural inclination for mimicking sounds and mimicking accents, and you don't put that much effort into paying attention to your accent, then you might never get there. So, yeah, there's that. So, Shabak asks, you've kind of touched on this a little here and there, but I was wondering about the extent to which I should be embracing ambiguity. A lot of times I'll find a sentence that I can understand the message that's being said, and it's a great fun sentence to learn the reading and or meaning of a word, but maybe there's a particle usage I don't understand, or the sentence structure can make sense to me, but it's really hard to internalize. I realize you could rate the sentence as an I+2, but what if it's a sentence I really like, and remembering the information I want to remember it is an easy task to accomplish during reps? Would making the card, basically meaning/kanji reading for reasons, and then waiting for another card or more immersion to really dial in what exactly is happening with all parts of the sentence, i.e. embracing ambiguity, a thing I could do without too much worry? Or do you really recommend only mining sentences where the I+1 allows you to really internalize the sentence completely? I realize embracing ambiguity could have been only in reference to straight input, listening and reading, and not making flashcards, so I guess I'm just looking for some clarification on ambiguity. Sorry, I read that really badly. But it's basically on asking about making sentence cards for sentences that you don't fully understand. And I mean, first and foremost, I mean, it doesn't really matter. Like, you make a sentence card, you don't totally understand it, nothing's going to happen, you know? Like you said, you can still memorize the meaning of the word and the reading of the word. So it doesn't really matter. But, I mean, ideally, you want to understand... I mean, what matters most is that you don't bullshit yourself, and that you pretend you understand something when you really don't. That's the biggest thing you want to avoid. You don't want to convince yourself, oh, yeah, I know what this means. It probably means this, right? You want to be very clear about what you're understanding and what you're not. And even if... sometimes what will happen is it's not that you straight up don't understand it. It's that you see that it could be one of two possibilities, but you don't know which of the possibilities it is. And that is also a form of not understanding. So you want to be very clear about whether you understand or not. Okay, like you said, it sounds like you're talking that you are aware of whether you understand or not. I mean, you kind of have to be asking this question, but you said maybe there's a particle usage you don't understand. So that's good. You want to pinpoint it. You want to be like, okay, I know overall what the sentence means. This is a good sentence for me to learn this new word. Like, I get how this new word functions in the overall sentence, but I still don't really get what this particle is doing over here. In a sentence like this, as long as you're very clear about what you understand and what you don't understand, I don't think there's too much harm about in making that into a sentence card. It just might be annoying when it comes up and you're like, oh yeah, I still don't really know what this means. But again, as long as you don't bullshit yourself and you're like, oh yeah, I remember I made the sentence. Yeah, I still don't really know what that means. And then you can give it a good grade, right? Because like I said, in previous videos, whether or not you grade a card good should be based off of whether you understood more after viewing the back of the card or not. So if a card comes up, you don't understand it, you look at the back of the card, you still don't understand it, then there's no point in failing the card because seeing the card more often isn't going to do anything for you. And so as long as that doesn't bother you too much, where your cards are coming up and you're like, oh yeah, I still don't understand this. That might be really annoying for some people. And the other thing you want to avoid is that you don't want to get caught up on it. You don't want it to come up and be like, oh yeah, I don't understand this. Let me see if I can figure it out this time. And you just sit and like contemplate it for 5 minutes. You don't want to do that either. But as long as you're the type of person who it comes up, you can be like, oh yeah, I don't understand that. But that's okay. And it doesn't bother you. And you can quickly move on and you don't get caught up contemplating it because it bothers you so much that you don't understand it. As long as you can avoid that, then I don't think there's that much harm in it. But the other thing that you want to be careful of is that you want to make sure that the thing that isn't quite clicking, if you're going to do this, is not related to the word you're learning. Like, if you're learning a certain, like, you know, you have this sentence, you're adding the sentence in order to learn the reading and meaning of a particular word, and you don't really get what that word means, because maybe you read the Japanese definition, and you don't really get what it means, you don't really get what the sentence overall means, but you're just like, yeah, fuck it, I'm just going to memorize it anyway. That you want to avoid, because if that's too much ambiguity, right? Like, that in that sense, you would really have no idea what's going on. You would want to avoid. But in the situation you're talking about, where you get the overall sentence and you get the I+1 word and what it's doing in the sentence, but there's just something else about the sentence that's not clicking, that I don't think there's too much harm in. But you want to at least make sure you do have a good idea of what the word actually means. Because otherwise that's going to be really kind of annoying to rep if you have stuff coming up that you like legit have no idea what's going on in it. But of course, this is only when, of course, ideally you want to actually understand the whole sentence. You don't want to have too many of these. You don't want to be going through your reps and you only understand like half the sentences fully. You want to understand a majority of them. But if, 1 or 2 out of every 10 cards that you make is not 100% clear, I would say that's fine if it works for you, right? Like, you gotta try it out. Like, I think when it comes to this kind of minutia about the SRS, there's going to be a lot of personal differences because different stuff's going to work for different people, So the best way to learn how to SRS effectively is just to try different stuff out and take notice of what works well for you and what doesn't. So if you try making some of these cards that don't quite click and you realize, hey, there's no harm in it. Like, I learned the sentence, when the word comes up in my immersion, I know what it means. Then by all means, like, if it's working, keep doing it. But if you're like, oh, this makes my repping suck because I don't know what the word means, and then I feel like the sentence doesn't stick as well, I get it wrong more often, then maybe don't do that. So I'd say if it works for you, then I don't think there's any real harm. Okay, so this is going to be the last question. So this might be a little late, but I'm putting MorphMan to use with the frequency list you provided, and it's working great so far. I'm nearing the point where I should make the monolingual transition, and I'm wondering if you think it would be a good idea to just make a list of dictionary vocabulary and put that in priority.db to make the transition easier. That way, MorphMan/Anki teaches you all the dictionary vocabulary you need to make the monolingual transition. I don't think this is a bad idea, but honestly, I don't really think that this would make that big of a difference, because the reason why dictionary vocabulary is dictionary vocabulary is because a lot of it is almost never used in real life or in anime and stuff like that. It's pretty much only used in the dictionary, and that is why making the monolingual transition is so hard, because even if you can understand anime really well, if you haven't practiced using the monolingual dictionary, there's still going to be a lot of stuff in it that you don't know. And so even if you put a list of the most common dictionary words in the frequency list, in the frequency.db, or sorry, the priority.db, I don't think that would make that big a difference, because probably a lot of those words you won't have any sentences that use those anyway. And also, I mean, I see a lot of people who basically think that as long as they just learn the common dictionary vocabulary, then functioning monolingually will be easy. But the thing you have to realize is that knowing the dictionary vocabulary is only half of the problem when it comes to being able to function monolingually. The reason why it's hard is that the grammatical structure of Japanese definitions can be very kind of dense and self-referential. And it can be very mind-twisting to try to understand what is referring to what in the definition and how the different words are actually working together, even if you know what the word means. And also, there are some words that are used outside of the dictionary, but they're used differently in the dictionary. Like, for example, like sama or yosu. Those words are used commonly outside of the dictionary, but when they're used in a dictionary, it has a more specific meaning. And so, really, I would view using the Japanese to Japanese dictionary as an isolated skill that you're going to have to train in isolation. And MorphMan, in the way that you're talking about, isn't really going to, it's just going to make a, small dents on the surface of the difficulty of making the transition. And I actually have more specific ideas about how you can use MorphMan in a different way to make the monolingual transition easier. And I'm going to be talking about that in a video in the next coming up week. So I think for all you guys that are thinking about MorphMan and the monolingual transition, I kind of want to just say wait for my video, because when I see people who haven't made the monolingual transition yet trying to contemplate ways to make it easier, a lot of it is kind of misguided just because they don't really get what functioning monolingually is or why it would be difficult or what it entails, which is kind of inevitable. I don't want to shit on anyone, but basically, yeah, I have some cool ideas in the future I think will improve it a little bit. And also, I just want to say that it's never going to be easy to make the monolingual transition, because the monolingual transition is fundamentally difficult to do. And although you can improve the process, I would be prepared to go through some amount of struggle when you make the monolingual transition and not give up easily, because I see a lot of people who they try to make the monolingual transition, they run into a wall, it doesn't go well, it's very difficult, and then they just immediately go into this mode where they're trying to find some shortcut to make it easier. Either that, or they just say fuck it, and then they just go back to being bilingual for a while, and they say, oh, I'm not good enough yet, I'll wait until I'm better. Or if you are the more kind of programmer type, you'll probably try to come up with some programming solution or some tool to try to make the monolingual transition easier. And really, that's not what you need. What you need is to just stick with it for a little bit, because if you just struggle through Japanese to Japanese definitions for 2 weeks, then you'll figure it out and it'll get way easier, right? Nothing valuable comes for free in this life, If you ever want any cool skills, it's going to come with some struggle and some racking your brain, and the monolingual transition is definitely an example of that. And so although I do have some ideas of how to improve the process, be prepared for it to be difficult, and just keep in mind that it's going to take a certain fixed amount of difficulty, or a fixed amount of struggle. The quicker you put in that struggle, the quicker you're going to finish. So if you just do nothing but struggle with monolingual definitions for 4 days straight, you'll probably have no problem with them after that. If you do it for an hour or two a day, then after 2 weeks, you should be totally fine and it will be no issue. So That's what I would try to focus on if you're struggling with the monolingual transition, rather than trying to find some shortcut. Although, of course, we do want to improve the process where it can be improved, and I do have some cool ideas for that in the future. So, thanks for listening. Sorry I was kind of sucked at talking today. I was doing other things that I was basically studying all day, and I was really stuck inside my head, and it was really hard to just come and try to be articulate in this video. So I feel like I was not as articulate as I can sometimes be, but hopefully it wasn't too bad. And thanks again for supporting me. Cool stuff coming in the future, and keep up your studies, guys.